Hello, everyone. Today's lecture will be on the diagnosis of substance use disorders. This will be a very important lecture, not only because of the content, but you are going to start seeing on all of your quizzes going forward a number of questions about the diagnosis of substance use disorders. Diagnosis of substance use disorders is a critical part of an initial client assessment for substance use disorder treatment. So the particular nature of the client's substance use disorder, including the severity level, which you're going to define by clinical standards, forms the basis for the specific treatment goals and the type or level of treatment required. Meaning, does the client need inpatient residential treatment or detox or some other variation? And note that the substance use disorder diagnosis is also usually used by funders to determine allowances for payment and for treatment services. So let's talk about funders for a second here, because funders are going to be a very big part of your life as a certified alcohol and drug counselor. And you may find that they are the bane of your existence as well. So a funder is whoever is paying for the treatment services. So depending upon where you work, the funder may be the client themselves. So if it's a private pay facility, the funder may be a private insurance company like Blue Cross Blue Shield or Kaiser Permanente. The funder could be a public healthcare insurance program like California State Drug Medi-Cal, which is a insurance program for lower income people or people below a certain income threshold. The funder may be a grant that's funding your particular program to serve a certain population, or any other number of various types of funding entities. So when I talk about funder, I'm talking about who's actually going to pay for those services. Now, many of you are going to probably end up initially working for or doing your internship at an agency that uses state drug Medi-Cal monies. There are a number of very large treatment programs here in San Diego that have multiple facilities across the county, and they primarily will get their funding from the state public healthcare insurance program. That's great. You can, definitely do that. I encourage you to work for those programs, but just please be aware that Drug Medi-Cal is not the only funder out there. There are other programs that don't use California Drug Medi-Cal, in which case whatever Drug Medi-Cal's rules are will only apply to people taking Medi-Cal funding. That's the deal with the funders. Funders basically get to set the rules for how they're going to get paid. And they say, hey, I don't have to pay you. You can get payment from other people, but if you want my money, then here's the things you have to do. Here's the type of forms I want. Here's the boxes I want checked, all that stuff. And if you want my money, then do what I'm telling you to do. And if you don't want my money, then don't do what I'm telling you to do and go find the money somewhere else. So I want you to keep that in mind as I talk about these next couple of slides here. I've added these slides in recent semesters because of the fact that people are very confused about whether or not alcohol and drug counselors can actually diagnose substance use disorders. So the answer is that in California, either a medical doctor or a licensed mental health clinician or a certified alcohol and drug counselor can, by law, diagnose a substance use disorder. Note, however, there are some funders who may require a signature or a co-signature, meaning that it's got your signature on it and their signature. So that they may require a signature from an MD, who's a medical doctor, or a PhD, who would be a clinical psychologist, or a licensed mental health clinician for the substance use disorder diagnosis on the submitted intake assessment paperwork. For those of you that end up working at a facility that uses state drug Medi-Cal funding, they came up with their own acronym for licensed mental health clinicians. They call them licensed practitioners of the healing arts, the LPHA, which seems like kind of a fancy name to me for a mental health clinician. But As it is, I know that many, if not all, of the drug Medi-Cal programs will want the LPHA to either do the assessment where there's a substance use disorder, or they're going to want the LPHA to sign the assessment, because at various points over the last couple of years, that was a requirement. Who knows what the requirements will be tomorrow. But note that many times when a funder does require a signature from a licensed clinician, it's still the alcohol and drug counselor who does the actual assessment and makes the initial diagnosis, which is then reviewed by and signed by a licensed clinician before submission. We do that at the treatment facility where I work. When I'm not teaching at the college, I'm a clinical director at a treatment program that does not use state drug Medi-Cal funding, but we do take private insurance. And there are some insurance companies that want a licensed clinician's signature. So the certified drug and alcohol counselor does the assessment, makes the diagnosis, and then a licensed clinician looks over the paperwork, makes sure that it looks right, and simply co-signs the submission. So as I said earlier, individual funders have the right to some degree. There's some restrictions, but for the most part, they can set their own rules. If a treatment facility wants to be paid by that funder, it's you want our money, then you do what we say. But alcohol and drug counselors are 100% able and required by state law to be trained, and you will be trained, in the criteria for substance use disorder diagnosis, and to, quote, apply accepted criteria for diagnosis of substance use disorders in making treatment recommendations. So the bottom line is that alcohol and drug counselors not only can, but in my opinion, should be the clinician who's making the initial substance use disorder diagnosis, as it's the alcohol and drug counselor who has literally hundreds of hours more training in substance use disorders than any other behavioral health clinician that's out there. I talk about this in a little more detail in the introductory lecture that was previously posted. So if your agency decides to have the mental health clinician do the assessment and diagnosis of substance use disorders, then fine, but you're encouraged to be the consulting expert, meaning don't hesitate to weigh in on that. And don't be surprised that if you leave that facility and you go get a job in another facility, they're going to expect you to know how to do a substance use disorder diagnosis. All right, with that out of the way then, let's talk about substance use diagnosis and the criteria. Most agencies will use the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 5th edition, or the DSM-5. Most of you have probably already heard about the DSM-5 as you've moved your way through the AODS program. There is another classification out there called the ICD-10, which is an international classification of diseases and related health problems. They have slightly different criteria for how you diagnose a substance use disorder, but the DSM and the ICD-10 are the two that are used by 95% of the treatment programs that are out there, and that funders, I've never heard of funder not accepting a DSM or an ICD-10 diagnostic. And in my experience, almost every single treatment facility in San Diego that I'm aware of uses DSM-5 criteria. So you're going to be taught in the DSM-5 criteria. The ICD-10 criteria is pretty close to that. Note that ASAM, the American Society for Addiction Medicine, also has established criteria for diagnosing substance use disorders. And while ASAM has become incredibly influential with the ASAM assessment for determining the level of care that the client gets, at this point, the ASAM criteria for diagnosing substance use disorders is considered secondary to the DSM-5. I've used the word criteria and criterion. So a criterion is singular and criteria is plural. So if there's a bunch of criterion, then that is criteria. So criteria is simply a principle or a standard by which something may be judged or decided. So they're guidelines. Now, there are many examples of criterion that are out there in the world that are used as a standard to judge something or decide something. Speed limits would be a great example of that. So if the speed limit that's posted is 55 miles an hour, then that's the criterion for determining whether or not someone is speeding. If they are below 55 miles an hour, they're not speeding. If they're above 55 miles an hour, they are speeding. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about criteria, is simply some standard by which somebody can make a decision about whether it exists or it doesn't exist, or the level, et cetera. The diagnostic criteria are used as guidelines for making diagnoses, along with clinical judgment. In making a substance use disorder diagnosis, there are 11 criteria that the DSM-5 lists that should be evaluated to determine whether or not there is a substance use disorder diagnosis, and to what degree. But in order to determine whether or not somebody meets that criteria, you're going to use lots of clinical judgment and your knowledge of the client. When I say clinical judgment, that'll include previous information you have from assessments. Maybe you got previous medical records from the client's last treatment facility, material you get out of the clinical interviews that you do with the client, questionnaires the client fills out, observations, biological testing like UAs and things like that. Clinical consultation with a multidisciplinary team. So they may have information that you don't otherwise have, or information that may conflict with something that the client told you, and you'll use that to try and determine, do they meet the criteria or not meet the criteria. So note that you are allowed to use information given to you by any member of the multidisciplinary team, including residential staff, mental health, other team members, in order to determine or establish a diagnosis. An example of this might be that you meet with the client for an initial intake and you're asking them the DSM-5 criteria, which we will review shortly, and they just tell you, no, 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 right? Everything, no, they don't meet any of the criteria. But then later on, they're talking in the residential floor with some of the other people in the program, and now they're starting to share information about the fact that they used to drink, a case of beer every day, and on the weekends they were drinking much more, and a residential staff member overhears that. So the residential staff member gives you that information. In that case, you've got evidence that the client would meet the criteria for tolerance. And you can use that then when you're making a diagnosis. You simply need to document where the information came from in your notes. To determine a diagnosis for a substance use disorder, there are a couple of requirements in the DSM. So first, you must determine that the use of substances is causing negative consequences. If there is no evidence that the use of substances is causing negative consequences, then you don't have a substance use disorder. You could have unhealthy substance use. Maybe the person drinks 2 to 3 beers every night, and on the weekend they drink 5 or 6 every day. The continued use of alcohol and drinking that much beer might not be particularly healthy. It may cause them to gain weight. They may, be spending a lot of time, drinking alcohol. But if it's not causing any negative consequences, then you can't have a substance use disorder. If somebody is smoking pot on the weekends, but it's not causing any relational problems, they're still maintaining a job, there's no health consequences, then that's not a substance use disorder by the DSM definition of that. So the use of the substances has to cause negative consequences. The consequences must be recurrent. So recurrent essentially means it happens more than once. So there needs to be repeated negative consequences. And the negative consequences must have happened within the last 12 months. So if somebody had negative consequences from their drinking when they were in college and they're now 46 years old, you can't use the negative consequences from when they were 19 years old to try and determine if they have a substance use disorder now. There are some criteria changes. This has become less relevant as the years have gone by, but the DSM-5 changed the criteria for a substance use disorder diagnosis from the DSM-4. And While the DSM-5 came out in 2013, it wasn't until 2018 that treatment facilities had to use the new DSM to determine a substance use disorder diagnosis. I leave this in here because I still periodically come across paperwork where the DSM-4 is listed. And some of you may be familiar with DM4 diagnostic criteria, not the DSM-5. So we'll review this quickly. So the biggest change in the DSM-5 was that there used to be separate diagnoses for substance abuse and substance dependence. That is no longer the case. Since 2013, there is only one diagnosis. It is a substance use disorder. So this was recognition that substance use is on a spectrum versus having two distinct disorders, meaning that substance abuse and substance dependence are on the same line. It's just where it falls on that line. The model here of the spectrum is listed below, and it's helpful to understand how this is now depicted. On the very far left side would be no use. Person doesn't use substances at all. And then there's a huge segment of people who use substances experimentally, meaning they use them just periodically. Maybe somebody experiments with psilocybin mushrooms. They've never used them before, and a friend says, hey, you want to try mushrooms? And they're like, yeah, sure, I'll try mushrooms. That's experimental use. That's not a substance use disorder. Social and recreational use is not considered a substance use disorder. So if they have a couple beers at the Padres game, or they go out to happy hour on Fridays with their coworkers, that's not a substance use disorder. Regular and daily use starts moving a little closer here, but if the regular and daily use is not causing negative consequences, then that's not considered a substance use disorder. And binging is not considered a substance use disorder. It used to be a form of substance abuse, but there's recognition now that if somebody periodically gets wasted, but it's not causing any other negative consequences in their life. Maybe they know that they're going to go out on Friday happy hour with their coworkers and get hammered. That's the plan. They do that every Friday, but they don't drive. They get an Uber. They make sure that they've got nothing going on Saturday morning so they can sleep off their hangover, and that's just what they do on a Friday night. Then that's not a substance use disorder. It's over here on the far right that we start to see a substance use disorder on the spectrum, where the use of the substances is now causing recurrent negative consequences and problems. We'll talk more about what that looks like. The DSM-5 also added craving, or a strong desire to use a substance, as one of the criterion for a substance use disorder. That was not there in the DSM-5. This actually came from neurophysiological research, where they noted that using drugs or alcohol changes the brain, and specifically the parts of the brain that are implicated in reward and motivation. AODS 157, the pharmacology class that Wendy Wheel teaches, goes into much greater detail about the reward system and the impact of the reward system. But what happened was they found that people who had substance use disorders would show neurobiological signs that they were having craving experiences. One of the things that they did was they put people into functional MRI machines. They're basically machines that you can see brain activity in real time. And so they had people in these fMRI machines, and it's a big tube, and they're looking up above them, and there's a screen. And on that screen, they're flashing pictures. They show them a picture of a puppy. They show a picture of a house. They show a picture of it raining. Then they show a picture of a crack pipe. And all of a sudden, the area of the brain that's associated with reward flashes. There's activity there. And they use this as recognition that when somebody is feeling craving, they're actually literally feeling it in their brain. The brain's responding to it. So now that's one of the criteria used to determine a substance use disorder, because experimental cocaine users don't have the same neurological reaction as somebody that's developed what we used to call an addiction. The DSM-5 also removed recurrent legal problems as one of the criterion for a substance use disorder. They found that it wasn't a direct correlation. There are many people in the adult and adolescent population who met criteria for a substance use disorder who didn't have recurrent legal problems. There's lots of cultural and socioeconomic factors that influence legal problems. And recurrent legal problems represents more social problems than it does a substance use disorder. In addition, it's really difficult to apply that criteria internationally. Like, for example, the ICD-10, cravings would be cravings, whether you lived in Kazakhstan or you live in Philadelphia. Whereas recurrent legal problems, legal consequences for drinking alcohol would be very different in Kazakhstan than it would be in Philadelphia. And so we're not comparing apples to apples. The DSM-5 added a severity level for the substance use disorder, and it's simply based on the number of criteria that are endorsed. So if 2 to 3 of the criteria listed in the DSM-5 are met, then it is a mild substance use disorder. If 4 or 5 of the criteria are met, it's a moderate substance use disorder. And if 6 or more criteria are met, then it is a severe substance use disorder. There are also new specifiers that include in a controlled environment and on maintenance therapy. The DSM-5 also added cannabis withdrawal. There's recognition that cannabis is physically addictive, meaning that there is tolerance to cannabis. You need more and more to get the same effect, and there are also withdrawal patterns. And they revised tobacco use disorder criteria to match those of the other substance use disorders. The DSM-5 removed polysubstance dependence, which was used to designate 2 or more substance disorders. So now you have to list each separate disorder. So somebody could have a heroin use disorder that is severe, and they could have an alcohol use disorder that's mild and sustained remission. So now we have to list out every single disorder and the specifiers. And the DSM-5 added some criteria for intoxication and withdrawal and substance-induced disorders, which I'm not going to be covering in this lecture since most of that is covered in pharmacology or AODS 157. When diagnosing a substance use disorder, the DSM-5 diagnosis is for current presentation, meaning their current use of the substance is what we're evaluating. Previous diagnoses should also be listed in the paperwork with the specifiers indicating the course. For example, sustained remission. Whoops, I don't want to show you that. So somebody might have a heroin use disorder, severe in sustained remission, meaning that they have not used heroin in more than 12 months, nor had any negative consequences associated with their heroin use in the last 12 months, because they gave up heroin about 18 months ago and took up methamphetamine. So you might have heroin use disorder, comma, severe, comma, in sustained remission. And then under that, based upon your evaluation, you may have methamphetamine use disorder, comma, severe. That would tell us that we've got 1 in remission, 1 that's current. Clinicians can also indicate diagnostic uncertainty by recording provisional following the diagnosis. You use this when there's a very strong presumption that the full criteria is going to be met, but you don't currently have enough information available to make a firm diagnosis. For example, you could have a court-ordered resistant client who refuses to answer any questions at the intake session. However, you know that they're coming in with 3 DUIs, and the last one, they blew a 2-2 on a breathalyzer. Which shows that they've continually used alcohol in a physically hazardous situation. And to blow a 2-2, if you can still drive a car, then you've clearly developed tolerance. But because the client hasn't answered enough questions so that we can determine whether it's mild, moderate, or severe, then we would put provisional after that diagnosis. Maybe we say to the client, okay, well, in order to participate in this program, you will have to answer these questions. Seems like you're not in a place to do that right now. So tell you what, why don't you come back tomorrow and we'll try this over again. And then when you're making your notes, you would make alcohol use disorder, comma, provisional. Or maybe the client shows up and they're intoxicated, so you can't complete the assessment, and then you might include provisional. All right, then let's talk about how we actually establish a diagnosis. So a substance use disorder can be applied to all classes of drugs except caffeine. There's no caffeine use disorder. The DSM-5 does recognize caffeine withdrawal as an actual diagnosis that allows doctors to prescribe certain medications because it's a recognized phenomenon, but there's no caffeine use disorder, even though clearly lots of people out there are addicted to caffeine, although typically caffeine does not cause negative consequences. The substance use disorder diagnosis is based on a, quote, pathological pattern of behaviors, that's in the DSM-5, related to the substance use. Substance use disorder, although I keep using that phrase, it's a general term that encompasses all classes of drugs. When you are actually diagnosing a particular client's use of substances as a disorder, then you're going to substitute the type of drugs that they used, so alcohol, for example, for the word substance. So it's not a substance use disorder if the person's been using alcohol, it's an alcohol use disorder. And then if the person meets criteria for more than one substance use disorder, they have an alcohol use disorder and a cannabis use disorder, then each of those two diagnoses should be recorded. The classes of drugs here, alcohol, cannabis, hallucinogens, PCP, inhalants, etc. Just note that each one of these classes of drugs, you could have a use disorder. And then other is unknown drugs. In this case, this is when the specific drug that's being used is not known, or if it doesn't fall into an established category. It's really crazy nowadays how many chemists are out there making all kinds of crazy drugs. It actually isn't chemically marijuana, but they're using a synthesized version of marijuana in which they mess with the chemistry somewhat, and then they sell it in a crystalline fashion that you can smoke. There's lots and lots of stuff like that going on out there right now. So if the drug doesn't fall in a particular category, then it's an other. Now, this is very important because there have been students who reported to me that they've gotten different information when they've been at classes at City College. This is taken directly out of the DSM. You can see the citation down there. It's on page 485 if you want to go find it yourself. When you are diagnosing a substance use disorder, quote, the clinician should use the code that applies to the class of the substances, but record the name of the specific substance. The code is either from the DSM or the ICD-10, and it's used for billing purposes. So, for example, 304.110 is a DSM-5 code. F13.20 is an ICD-10 code. So the clinician should record the class code, but alprazolam, which is Xanax, is the disorder. So you wouldn't put that it is a sedative, hypnotic, or anxiolytic disorder. Instead, you would put that it is a Xanax disorder. Or, for example, you would put a mild methamphetamine use disorder rather than a mild stimulant disorder. You would have a severe heroin use disorder rather than a severe opioid use disorder. Now note, that is what the DSM tells you, and that is what I am going to have you do for this class. I do recognize that some students have come back and told me that they work at an agency where they're using an electronic document that doesn't give them the option to select the specific substance, meaning there is no methamphetamine use disorder in the dropdown. All there is stimulant disorder in the dropdown. That's fine. Use whatever you need to do so that you can get your paperwork submitted for billing, but note that the DSM has said that you should be recording the name of the specific substance. As I said earlier, the diagnosis requires a problematic of substance use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress. That's a fancy phrase for negative consequences, as manifested by meeting at least 2 diagnostic criteria. Remember, you have to have 2 to 3 criteria to even get to mild that occur during a 12-month period. The 11 primary diagnostic criterion that are used to identify a substance use disorder can be grouped into 4 major categories. You will need to be very familiar with these categories, not only for my class, but for some of the questions that will be on the quizzes. It's important to note that a category is different from a criterion. So that one shouldn't be there. Impaired control over substance use. That is the category. So the category of losing control over the substance use has 4 criterion in there. The first one is that the substance is taken in larger amounts or over a longer period than initially was intended. So if somebody says to themselves, I'm only going to have 2 drinks, and then they go out and they have 8, then that's an example that they took more than they initially intended to. Or they say, I'm only going to stay for an hour at happy hour on Friday, and then at 10 o'clock at night, they're still in the bar and their spouse is calling saying, where are you? So that would be an example of the substance taken in larger amounts or a longer period than initially was intended. The second one is that there is a persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control substance use. So if the person has tried repeatedly to limit the amount of the substance that they use, they tell themselves that, man, I really need to stop smoking weed. You know, during the week, I'm only gonna smoke weed on Friday and Saturday, and then they fail and they continue to smoke pot during the week. Then that's an example of them making an attempt to cut down or control their substance use and failing to do so. The third one is a great deal of time spent in activities necessary to obtain, use, or recover from the effects of the substance. Now, this is probably the best example of where clinical judgment needs to be used, because a great deal of time spent is not really defined. So if somebody has one glass of wine with dinner every night, maybe they are Italian and they are living in San Diego because they're on a graduate school fellowship, and in their family, you have a glass of wine with dinner every night, and that's what they do, then you wouldn't say, oh, I got it. That's a great deal of time that they're spending using alcohol. Check, I've met that criteria. You got to use clinical judgment here. A great deal of time spent, right? One glass of wine with dinner 7 days a week, probably not a great deal of time spent. Spending hours each day trying to find, where the dealer is, making sure that your heroin is in a place that nobody can find it, planning out your day of exactly when you're going to use it so that you don't use too much or you won't get sick, setting aside time so that you can recover for the substance, then you may judge that a great deal of time is being spent in those activities. Again, the clinical judgment for all the criteria is really important, because you are the one that's going to determine whether or not the criteria has been met. The fourth criterion in impaired control over substance use is craving, or the strong urge to use the substance. This could occur at any time, but typically craving symptoms show up when the person's in an environment where a drug was previously used or obtained. This is the classic persons, places, and things that you consider when you're developing a relapse prevention plan. The second category is social impairment. Social impairment meaning that the use of substances is causing problems socially or relationally. The first criteria is that the recurrent, more than once, use of the substance results in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. The clinical judgment piece is trying to determine, what does failure to fulfill major role obligations actually mean? If somebody is able to get up and go to work and maybe they have a hangover, but they get to work on time, they complete all of their work, they feel ill, but there's no negative consequences at work, then that's probably not a failure to fulfill your major role obligation at work. However, if the use of the substance is such that they're constantly calling in late or calling in sick or having their spouse do it, or they can't complete their work, then that would probably be a failure to fulfill major role obligations. Similarly with school, if the fact that they're getting loaded all the time is getting in the way of them being able to study and pass their exams, well, that's a major role obligation that you have when you're a student. You need to be able to do that. If the use of the substance is causing them to neglect their children, maybe the person doesn't work and is not at school, but they're at home and they have 3 kids, and the use of the substance is causing them to neglect those children, they're leaving them alone as they leave to go visit the dealer, then that would be failing the major role obligation of being a parent in this case. The second criteria in the social impairment category is the continued use of the substance despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused or exacerbated by the effects of the substance. In everyday language, that basically means that you keep using even though it's causing problems, socially for you or relationally for you. So if you're continuing to have arguments with your spouse about the fact that you're constantly intoxicated, then that would be an example of meeting the criteria Or if the person is completely withdrawn and they're not spending time with friends any longer because they're afraid of judgment from their friends about the fact that they're always stoned, then that would be an example of continuing to use the substance in spite of the fact that it's causing interpersonal problems. And then the last criterion in the social impairment category is that important social, occupational, or recreational activities are given up or reduced because of substance use. So if you don't go to a wedding that you've been invited to because you're concerned that people will know that you're loaded, or you used to really enjoy playing tennis every week and now you don't play tennis anymore because you're getting high, then that would be an example of giving up social, occupational, or recreational activities to use a substance. The third category is risky use of the substance. There's two criteria in this category. The first one is recurrent substance use in situations in which it is physically hazardous. Driving a car while impaired by the substance is clearly using the substance in a way that's physically hazardous. But note that this criterion can be met in a lot of different ways. So if you are using dirty needles, for example, that's using a substance in a situation in which it is potentially physically hazardous, and yet you continue to do so. The second criterion in the risky use of the substance category is continued substance use despite knowledge of having a persistent physical or psychological problem that is likely caused by or exacerbated by the substance. Out of all the criterion, I actually like this one the most. Essentially what this is trying to determine, does the person have a physical or psychological problem that is likely because of the fact that they're using, and they know it, but they continue using anyway. So an example of this might be that a person has headaches all the time, persistent headaches. They have them every morning, they have them every day, but lo and behold, as soon as they get off work and they start having a couple drinks, the headaches go away. And they go to the doctor and they're like, "Doc, I have this headache all the time." And the doc says, well, what are you doing that might cause that? Are you drinking enough water? You know, do you do this? Like, are you drinking, you know, to excess? Well, no, I'm not drinking to excess. I mean, I like my beers. And the person knows that the drinking of alcohol might be a contributing factor to the headaches, but they still keep drinking anyway. People who don't have substance use disorders wouldn't do that. A person who's a normal drinker, if they realize that the use of alcohol was causing them persistent headaches, then they might stop using alcohol to see how that affects their headaches. But somebody with a substance use disorder would not. Psychological problems, somebody who suffers from depression, and you know, they're also a daily drinker or a daily pot smoker. And you know, here it's, well, do you think maybe your daily pot smoking might have something to do with the fact that you're feeling depressed? Perhaps we should quit using pot and see how that affects the depression. And the person's like, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. Then that would be an indication that they know they have a psychological problem that's either being caused by the pot, or certainly it's being exacerbated or affected by the pot, but they don't give the pot up. Now, you don't need proof that the problem exists. It's just the failure to abstain from using substances, even though you know it's probably causing or contributing to the problem, that gives you evidence to meet this criteria. Then the last category is the pharmacological criteria. So there's two of them here. So tolerance is the first of the pharmacological criteria. There are two ways that you can determine whether or not somebody has tolerance. The first one is a need for markedly increased amounts of the substance to achieve intoxication or the desired effect. So, you know, if you started out by drinking 2 beers and that gave you a big buzz, and now you need to drink a 12-pack before you've got a buzz, then that would be an example of increased amounts of the substance needed in order to achieve intoxication. Or a markedly diminished effect with continued use of the same amount of the substance. So there's people who use maintenance heroin in order to avoid going through heroin withdrawal, and that same amount doesn't get them intoxicated anymore. It just keeps them from being sick, because now in order to get intoxicated, you know, maybe they're using 1.5 grams a day, which would be a lot of that in order to achieve intoxication, but they're using 0.5 gram, you know, or 1/4 gram in the morning in order to try and put off being sick. Those would both be examples of tolerance. The second criterion in the pharmacological category is withdrawal. Withdrawal can be manifested by either of two things. So either the person develops the characteristic withdrawal syndrome for the substance used. Different substances have different types of withdrawals associated with them. The delirium tremens, or the DTs, are associated with withdrawing from alcohol. Severe nausea and sickness is associated with withdrawing from heroin. Wendy goes over this in the AODS 157 class for the different withdrawal syndromes. But this one's very important. Note that if the person is taking the substance or a closely related substance to avoid withdrawal symptoms, then you have evidence of withdrawal. So if somebody is using a maintenance dose of heroin to avoid kicking or getting sick, then even though they're not showing withdrawal symptoms, that by itself is evidence that they would have withdrawal symptoms if they weren't continuing to use that. Or if somebody's taking Valium when they stop drinking, or a variation of benzodiazepines to avoid the withdrawal symptoms, then you have evidence that there's actually withdrawal. Note that when you're trying to determine pharmacological criteria, if the person has symptoms that only occur as a result of medical treatment, somebody was on narcotics, they broke their back in a car accident, and they're on narcotics that are being prescribed by a physician. They're titrating down off the narcotics, yet they're still having some symptoms of withdrawal. That's not evidence of a substance use disorder as long as the person is taking the medications as prescribed. However, there are certainly many people out there who abuse prescription medications. So if they're abusing prescription medications in order to avoid withdrawal, or they need more and more of that because they're using them to get high, then you definitely can use that to determine whether or not they meet tolerance and withdrawal criteria. The DSM-5 also established severity levels. So you are going to use those 11 criteria to determine what is the severity level of the substance use disorder. So as you go through the 11 criteria, typically in an intake, there'll be questions on the intake related to each of those 11 criteria. And you're going to ask questions to try and determine that. You may ask a question like, do you have any kind of physical symptoms, maybe like headaches, or some psychological symptoms, maybe like depression, that you think might be related to your use of alcohol, but you continue using alcohol anyway? That would clearly be going after the criteria for continued use in spite of the fact that it's causing or exacerbating a problem. So you get that and you check, got that. You might ask, well, so how many beers does it take you to get a buzz? Oh man, geez, I don't know, like a lot. 6-pack probably, maybe 12. Wow. Has it always been that way? Like when you first started drinking, would you have to drink 12 to get a buzz? No. When I first started drinking, I would just have a couple and it'd give me a buzz. Check. Now I have the criteria for tolerance. So what you're going to do is, once you determine how many criteria out of the 11 you have, now you know the severity level. So if you have 2 or 3 criteria out of the 11, then it's a mild substance use disorder. If you have 4 or 5 criteria, it's a moderate substance use disorder. And if you have 6 or more, so 6 to 11 of the criteria, then it's a severe substance use disorder. This is a very important thing to understand. You cannot assign a severity level until you have evidence for individual criteria. There was a bunch of treatment agencies in Orange County that got in trouble for a whole bunch of things that they were doing that was unethical and illegal. But one of the things that happened was they gave everybody a severe substance use disorder without counting criteria or showing evidence of that criteria, because people with severe substance use disorders typically get more days in treatment and more funding. You cannot say, well, it's severe. I just look at them and obviously it's causing them problems. You need to have evidence. You need to have evidence on the intake assessment that you know that they met this criteria. That's why you're determining that 6 or more of them make it severe. There's a couple of other specifiers that you can use. So if somebody is in early remission, that means that within the last 12 months, at one point, they did meet criteria for a substance use disorder, but they have not been using substances for at least 3 months and no more criteria are being met. This is typically when somebody's in treatment. So maybe somebody went to detox and then they did a 1-month residential intake treatment program, and now they're in your IOP program. So they've been sober for 4 months, and right now they're not meeting any criteria. Except for craving. Craving is the one criteria that's allowed even after 3 months. So maybe they still have cravings, but they're not having any other negative consequences. Then let's say that they had a heroin use disorder that was severe. They have not used heroin in 4 months. Then you would have heroin use disorder, comma, severe, comma, in early remission. So early remission is there's been at least 3 months with no negative consequences, but less than 12 months. And then sustained remission is the same thing. The only difference here is that none of the criteria have been met for a substance use disorder for 12 months or longer. So somebody did detox, residential, IOP, outpatient, aftercare, they haven't used in 13 months, and there's been no negative consequences for 13 months. Then we've got heroin use disorder, comma, severe, comma, in sustained remission. There are 2 additional specifiers that are applied. So in a controlled environment states that the environment is restricting access to alcohol and other controlled substances. In a controlled environment is typically used after the remission statement. So if somebody is in early remission, comma, in a controlled environment because they still are living in a residential intake, there's not a lot of these programs anymore, but there used to be inpatient programs that might be a 6-month program. So in that case, they're in early remission, comma, but they're in a controlled environment. So the controlled environment basically says that the environment is restricting access to alcohol and drugs, which may contribute to why they're substance-free. It's important information from a diagnostic standpoint. So a controlled environment could be a lot of different places. If somebody's in jail or prisons, now, I'm fully aware of the fact that there is lots of people who are using in jails or prisons, but typically jails and prisons restrict or control access to alcohol and other drugs. You can't just walk up to the bar in a prison, right, and order yourself a cocktail. Inpatient and locked hospital units or residential inpatient programs. Again, certainly people have figured out how to smuggle alcohol and drugs into hospital units, but still that would be considered a controlled environment. A therapeutic community would be a sober living facility in which you are UA'd, daily or regularly or randomly. So they are controlling the use and access to drugs and alcohol. If you bring drugs and alcohol onto the property, then you're kicked out of the sober living. That would be a therapeutic community. Now note that somebody just living in a sober living, anybody can create a sober living nowadays. There's no requirements in California. So I could say, hey, my house is a sober living and everybody who lives here is going to be sober, but I'm not testing anybody. I'm not, controlling access in any way. Maybe people come home and they're wasted and they're allowed to continue staying there. That would not be a therapeutic community and it would not be a controlled environment. So again, you'll have to use clinical judgment to determine. An additional specifier in the DSM-5 is on maintenance therapy. So on maintenance therapy is used if somebody is taking a medication, for example, to avoid withdrawal symptoms, or as part of treatment to try and forestall relapse. So methadone or naltrexone, Suboxone, Subutex, things like that. Then you would have something like heroin use disorder, comma, severe, comma, in early remission, comma, in a controlled environment, comma, on maintenance therapy. So it's giving you lots of information about the nature of the substance use disorder. Now note that SAMHSA, the U.S. Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, came out with their own specifier that they refer to as medication-assisted treatment. And ASAM, the American Society for Addiction Medicine, has adopted MAT, or medication-assisted treatment, as a specifier. That is the same thing as on maintenance therapy. DSM-5 calls it on maintenance therapy. SAMHSA, ASAM call it medication-assisted treatment. You use whatever your agency uses, and as long as the funder is fine with that, then you'll be good. All right. The diagnostic codes I mentioned earlier. So when you are creating a substance use disorder diagnosis, there'll be a code for it. I'm not going to spend too much time on codes, and I don't expect you to memorize the codes. So basically, the code tells you what class of drugs the substance use disorder is. Most of the agencies in San Diego now have computerized or electronic record software that figure this out for you. You put in alcohol use disorder severe, and it'll tell you what the code is. Those that don't, your agency should have some kind of a cheat sheet that tells you what the codes are for the different classes of drugs. You don't need to know this unless you're actually working in the billing department. And some agencies will use different codes like ICD-10, but I've seen it. There's actually a sheet that says if the ICD-10 code for alcohol use severe is this, the DSM-5 code is this. And so you would just put whatever code is appropriate. These are just examples of recording substance use disorders. So the code for alcohol use disorder 305.00, alcohol use disorder mild and sustained remission. This might be somebody who's in recovery, they're more than 12 months sober and they're going to 12-step meetings. Alcohol use disorder moderate in early remission in a controlled environment. They've got more than 3 months sober but less than 12 months sober. They're in a sober living home, attending an intensive IOP program. Heroin use disorder, severe in early remission in a controlled environment on maintenance therapy. Then they met the criteria for heroin use disorder. They're less than 12 months sober, but more than 3. They're currently in an inpatient treatment facility with nursing staff on site, and they're taking Suboxone. Okay, methamphetamine use disorder moderate means there's less than 3 months sober, or they're not in treatment and they're actively using. All right. The last part that I'm going to touch upon briefly in this lecture are gambling disorders. So alcohol and drug counselors are also qualified to diagnose gambling disorders. Gambling disorders are included in the DSM-5. There's recognition that substance use disorders and gambling disorders are very similar neurobiologically. Essentially, they activate the brain's reward system in the same way. You put them in fMRI machines and you see the same areas of the brain light up. They've also found that symptoms of gambling disorders, such as craving, continuing to gamble in spite of the fact that it's causing interpersonal problems, are very similar to substance use disorders. And they've also found that gambling use disorders respond to similar treatment for substance use disorders. Things like support groups, variations of sponsors and such are helpful with gambling disorders. So just briefly, gambling disorders, same thing. There needs to be persistent and recurrent gambling behavior that's causing negative consequences or clinically significant impairment or distress. In this case, there needs to be 4 or more criteria met in a 12-month period. Need to gamble with increasing amounts of money in order to achieve the desired excitement. Is restless or irritable when attempting to cut down or stop gambling. Has made repeated unsuccessful efforts to control, cut back, or stop gambling, is often preoccupied with gambling, having persistent thoughts about gambling, often gambles when feeling distressed, so depressed, anxious, guilty. After losing money in gambling, will often return another day to get even or chase their losses, lies to conceal the extent of their involvement with gambling, has jeopardized or lost a significant relation, job, or educational career opportunity because of gambling, and relies on others to provide money to relieve desperate financial situations caused by gambling. So I'm not an expert in gambling disorders. If you go work at a place that treats gambling disorders, you'll learn even more about this, but it's still the same principle. You use your clinical judgment to determine if in fact they've met any of the criteria. If they've met 4 or more of the criteria, then they have a diagnosable gambling disorder, which means you can submit that to insurance companies and get reimbursed for it. Mild severity is 4 to 5 criteria, moderate 6 to 7, severe 8 to 9. And then gambling disorders also have their own specifiers of episodic, persistent, early remission, and sustained remission. All right, so for more information about substance use disorder diagnosis, I've given you some links here. There also is a Dsm Mobile App that is available on the Apple software system and the Android operating system for $70. you do not need to purchase the DSM-5. It's not a requirement for this class. It is certainly a good thing to have around. This is a co-occurring disorders class. You're expected to be familiar with the symptoms associated with mental health disorders as well. But again, it's not a requirement. I've given you everything you need to know in order to be able to diagnose substance use disorders. And most agencies have got a copy of the DSM around somewhere. I'm sure prices have come down some, but when it first came out, it was a very expensive text. All right, so you now have all the information you need in order to begin diagnosing substance use disorders. You are going to practice this week after week after week as you go through the quizzes over the course of the next 12 quizzes that are going to be posted for you on Canvas. In addition, there will be numerous questions on the final exam for diagnosing substance use disorders. My last statement about substance use disorders goes back to the fact that as an alcohol and drug counselor, you are supposed to be the expert in substance use disorders, not the psychiatrist, not the licensed marriage family therapist, you. So you need to know this stuff. I'm going to test the hell out of you to make sure that you know how to diagnose substance use disorders, and I expect you to memorize these things. It's going to be really kind of embarrassing if on the multidisciplinary team, you don't actually know what the criteria are for diagnosing a substance use disorder. So take notes. There are actually some handouts on Canvas in the handout section. If you go to Files, you'll see a folder for substance use disorder diagnosis. I've got some handouts there that have the 11 criteria, questions related to determining whether or not you meet those criteria. Make sure that you've familiarized yourself with those. And as I said, you will get plenty of practice diagnosing substance use disorders as we go forward. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Good luck on your first quiz that has the substance use disorder diagnostic criteria.